Emblem Ike is here, and the meta is about to get thrown upside down because tanks are back on the menu. Welcome to the Ultimate Emblem Ike Guide. In this guide, I'll be covering all of Ike's preference skills and the new skill Laguz Friend 4, with visual examples. I'll be going over Ike's new Emblem Ring, including how it affects the current meta and tank builds. I'll be analyzing how powerful Emblem Ike is, what roles he performs best in, and what game modes he can excel in as well. I'll be going over Ike's best supports for Aether offense and Summoner Duels. I'll be discussing who else can use Laguz Friend 4 and how it can open up new roles and builds that we have never seen before. And finally, I'll be doing an Emblem Ring tier list discussing how powerful our two Emblem Rings currently are and how they compare against each other. There will be timestamps down below so you can jump to whatever section you want if you're looking for particular information. Before we start, if you want to see my reaction to the banner, check out my stream VOD with DTM. I will leave a link in the description with a time marker. Now let's get started because there is a massive amount to talk about. Let's start off by talking about the hero of the hour, Emblem Ike. Emblem Ike is a sword infantry unit with 41 HP, 63 attack, 45 defense, 18 speed, and 42 resistance. He has super boons in attack and defense, but he has banes in HP, speed, and resistance, which can be a bit rough. Ike's preference weapon, Emblem Ragnell, has several effects. First, slaying. Second, distant counter. He has penalty neutralization, no counter disrupt, anti-guard, and he can grant himself 16 attack while inflicting minus 16 attack on the foe. Next, let's talk about Emblem Ike's new preference special, Great Aether. And Ike has gotten one of the most complicated and ridiculous specials in the game. So let's break down what this exactly does. So this will boost Ike's damage by 40% to 80% of his attack. He will force the enemy to perform Vantage on him. The enemy will also get a Desperation effect. He will get 30 to 70% non-pierceable damage reduction. He will deal 5 damage after combat to any foe within 3 rows or 3 columns centered on himself. He will add +1 special cooldown to those foes as well. And then lastly, he will heal after combat, which will be the number of foes hit times 5 plus 10. With all that said, let's start breaking this down with some visual examples because this can be quite confusing. First, let's talk about Great Aether's damage. So essentially the way this will work in normal combat is, let's say Black Knight engages on Ike. Black Knight will attack Ike twice due to the forced desperation. Each hit will grant plus 10% attack boost to Ike when it procs his special. So in this situation, he'll get plus 20% and then plus 40% as the base, so the total will be 60% attack boost, which is quite hard hitting. But in the case of, let's say, a Brave combat, Black Knight will actually hit Ike 4 times because of the forced desperation, each time granting him plus 10% attack, for a total of 80% damage boost for Ike's Great Aether, which is actually absurd. And in the rare case of the unit having potent attacking into Ike, then he will actually get up to 90%. So that is just a massive attack, something you definitely don't want to get hit by. The next thing we have to talk about is Great Aether damage reduction. So the way this works essentially is that it takes into account Ike's current cooldown on his special. Great Aether is a 4 cooldown special, but because of slaying, it will be at 3. And then Laguz Friend will do -2 cooldown before Black Knight's first attack, so that will put Ike's cooldown at 1. So the first calculation will be 40% minus 1 cooldown for a total of 30% damage reduction, non-pierceable on that first attack. But Great Aether has a secondary effect where if you receive consecutive attacks, it will actually be 70% minus the current cooldown to get his non-pierceable DR. So in this situation, because he's always been hit once and he has anti-guard, it will be 0 cooldown, so he'll get 70% non-pierceable DR on every consecutive attack after that, which is extremely powerful. And lastly, Great Aether has an after combat effect, where as you can see in this example of the video, all the units within 3 rows or 3 columns will take 5 damage. So in this case, Freyr, Sonya, Famortis, and Oder. Then they also have their cooldown increased by 1, which is very powerful as it can turn off specials like Miracles or AoEs. And then lastly, he will heal 5 HP for every enemy. So in this case, there are 4 enemies, so he will heal 4 times 5 plus 10 or 30 HP. The one thing you have to definitely keep in mind though is it cannot exceed 50% of Ike's max HP, so in this case, it can only heal 20. Overall, this is an extremely powerful special, possibly the most powerful special in the game, which is ironic because Ike went from one of the worst specials in Radiant Aether to now this. Now let's move on to Laguz Friend 4, the new inheritable B skill. Laguz Friend 4 is one of the most powerful B skills we've ever had. It's extremely unique and very cool, so let's break it down. The first effect it's going to have is it's going to inflict attack -5 on the foe. The second thing is actually it has 2 conditions. So the first condition is that you have an offensive special with a max cooldown of 3 or you have a defensive special on the unit. And if you meet this condition, the unit will reduce their own pierceable damage reduction by 50%. So this is like damage reduction from like Spurn 4 or like NCD 4, it will get halved. Then you will gain an adaptive flat damage reduction based off 20% of the foe's defense or resistance, whichever is higher, but it will not work with AoEs. Then lastly, you will get a special jump 2 effect before the foe's first attack. So these are already some extremely powerful effects, but there's more. The next condition is going to be if you have an offensive special with the max 3 cooldown and the special triggers, you will deal 20% adaptive true damage based off either your defense or res, whichever is higher. Once again, not working with AoEs, and then you'll get full damage reduction piercing like Special Spiral 4. Now in the case you're using a defensive special, the way it will actually work is the next attack after your special procs, you'll get that same 20% adaptive true damage based off your defense or res, and then you'll get full damage reduction piercing on that attack as well. This tier 4 B slot is extremely powerful and fits really well into Emblem Ike's overall arsenal, as it pretty much fixes all the problems he has. It gives him a way to ramp into his big special consistently, it gives him a way to have flat damage reduction so it can combine with his percentage damage reduction, something we'll be talking about a lot more later on. It also gives him a way to pierce damage reduction, which is very good as well, and it's also very versatile as it can work with defensive or offensive specials. We'll talk more about Laguz Friend 4 a little bit later as I talk about other units who can use it extremely well and the builds they'll want to run. But for now, let's move on to Ike's best roles. When it comes to Ike's roles, he's only playing really one, and that is tank. He's very much a defensive tank, so he's really focusing on his defense and resistance and kind of just completely forsaking his speed. But because of that, he gets some extremely powerful strengths such as NCD and a ton of flat damage reduction. But that doesn't mean he's invincible. Let's talk about some of his weaknesses. Emblem Ike has a few major weaknesses. The first one I want to talk about is AoE specials. None of Ike's damage reduction works against AoEs, so it does mean Ike is quite vulnerable to them. He does have high defense and resistance, so that does naturally work well against it. But in the current game right now, units have a ton of ways to get true damage added to their AoEs, like a green, and so in that situation, he's definitely going to struggle. His second major weakness is that Ike forces desperation onto his enemies, which means that he can get hit 1 to 4 times before he can counterattack. Now obviously this does work into his kit quite well, but it does allow Ike to get hit a ton, so it does give the enemy a ton of opportunity to kill him. The next thing is Ike does force Vantage on his foes as well, so that means that if Ike is in player phase and he needs to kill somebody, sometimes he will die to the counterattack before he gets to hit them if he's like at low HP, or if they can nuke really hard, so like if they have like a brave attack or like a charge special. Also, Ike has no way to stop burn damage, which is a major powerful thing in the current nuke meta, but as it is right now, no tank does, so it's not anything really special. The other one is Ike lacks guard, and as a unit who's going to be getting hit a ton, you definitely want that guard effect. Stopping specials is a very big deal, and even if you do have non-pierceable DR, like a ridiculous amount like Ike does, anytime when you can stop a special, you're definitely going to want to. And the final weakness I'm going to bring up about Emblem Ike is that he has no guaranteed follow-up attack. He does hit extremely hard, so a lot of times he will just one-shot his enemies, but having a guaranteed follow attack could help secure kills against some more bulky enemies. Okay, let's talk about Ike's best game modes, and Ike is pretty much amazing in every single game mode. He's going to do extremely well in Arena as he's going to be able to score really high there and take a majority of the threats. He's going to be one of the best Omnitanks, if not the best Omnitank in Aether offense, and he's going to be able to play a raid boss role in Summer Duels as well. The only game mode that I don't see he might be used is something like Aether defense, but I'm sure someone can get creative and find a way to use him there as well. As Emblem Ike does want to play that Omni Tank or Raid Boss role, he's going to need some support. So let's talk about Emblem Ike's best supports in every single game mode. Let's start off with some general supports that work extremely well with Emblem Ike. First up, we're going to have Astra. Astra is a great unit to support like those slow Omni Tanks like Emblem Ike or Altina. As he does inflict guard on enemies within 4 spaces, he also gets a daunt effect of attack and defense -5, he also does follow-up denial, and he also puts a dual attack defense bonuses on the enemy as well, just giving way more bulk to your tanks. Another great option is actually the new Spring Mirabilis. She does something similar to Astra where she does offer that guard, and she does attack defense and res -5 on the foe, and when she dances she can give Ike bonus doubler while also inflicting panic, which is extremely powerful. And of course you can't forget she's also a dancer, so these two are some of the most powerful supports for Ike in my opinion. Another great option, of course, is just Legendary Eliwood. Legendary Eliwood works extremely well with Ike because Ike does have really high base attack, which means it is easy to hit those bonus doubler effects on him. It also gives him Null Panic, which is really nice as well. Don't confuse that with neutralized penalties, that is different. Null Panic will ensure that Ike gets to keep those visible buffs and use them in combat as long as the opponent doesn't have like a dull or a lull effect. And then lastly, he also gives Canto 1, which does allow Ike to just go in and kill things and then get back into position. The last support I want to talk about is Gatekeeper, and Gatekeeper is really an excellent support in my opinion in Aetherite's offense. He just gives Ike an additional +5 to all stats, which helps a ton, and extra healing. That 7 HP heal is something you definitely do not want to underestimate, and Ike really wants as much healing as possible so that he can just keep bouncing back after every single combat. And then lastly, of course, Gatekeeper is very well known for his anti-warp and obstruct effects, so that can help as well if you're running into like defense teams that are relying on like guidance or soaring guidance, or even like Hinoka lines or something like that. The really amazing thing about these 4 supports is that they don't need to be within 2 spaces of Ike to have these effects. They can kind of stand back and still grant the support, which is very relevant because it means that Soniki will not get any type of debuffs on Ike, and so her true damage and her damage reduction piercing gets turned off, which makes that matchup extremely easy for Ike. Some other really amazing supports that are really good for general use as well is like a unit like Hortensia. Hortensia really does a major job of debuffing the enemies while also granting some buffs to Ike as well. The one thing is there is a bit of redundancy there as she does give out the neutralize debuff effect, which Ike already has. Ball Maria is also an excellent choice as she can essentially give Ike that miracle and second life. The only thing is that she has to be within 2 spaces, so that's something you have to consider. Duo Micaiah is actually a great option as well, as she's just a massive stat debuffer on the entire enemy team, which can really cripple them and then just not let them have enough offensive power to get through Ike. Next, let's move on to Ike's best light mythics. So when it comes to Ike's best light mythics, I think these 4 are his top choices. We have Goto, Lumera, Lumilla, and Air. Goto is going to give him that HP and res mythic buff, which he really wants. Most notably though, he gives him 80% AoE damage reduction. And as I mentioned earlier, that is one of Ike's biggest weaknesses, so being able to cover that is massive and makes Ike way more difficult to take down. He also gives out a visible 6 defense and res, which helps Ike out a little bit as well. We then have Lumera. She's going to be giving that 5 HP in defense mythic buff. She gives +4 to all stats. She gives anti-guard, which is a bit redundant with Ike, but not that big of a deal. But most importantly, she gives out Divine Vein Stone in a massive space, which does give 50% AoE damage reduction as well, defense and res +6, and he gets 10 flat damage reduction against specials, which is really powerful. We then have Milla, who is an older mythic, but she is going to give that 5 HP in defense, +4 to all stats. She gives the dull attack bonuses to Ike, which is nice because it can turn off things like visible stat bonuses as well as bonus doubler. And then lastly, she also gives out Isolation and Guard. Guard is something Ike desperately wants, so that's very nice. And then Isolation can turn off dancers. Because Ike doesn't have like a obstruct effect in his kit, sometimes things can run past him, and so being able to isolate a dancer is a very nice bonus. And then lastly, we have Air, and she is literally the oldest mythic we have, but she's still really good with Ike, and the reason for that is she gives out 5 HP and res as a mythic buff, she gives an additional 5 res as well from her preference skill, and she heals 20 HP between turns, typically to Ike, which means that he just gets a ton of free healing, as he is going to be pretty far off by himself, so it could be difficult to get to him with like a healer or some other way. When it comes to some other light mythics as well, like Peony or Asker, the thing with Peony is that he doesn't really need speed, and he already neutralizes his own penalties, so her support isn't as vital. And when it comes to Asker, Asker is overall pretty solid, but he doesn't do anything like ridiculously amazing for Ike like these 4 can. Now let's move on to the Astra mythics Ike can work extremely well with. And the first one I want to talk about is Veil. Veil just gives Ike a ton of things, such as 5 HP in defense, Resonance Blades and Shields, which is effectively +4 to all stats, and a follow-up denial effect. She gives out visible attack and res +6, and the Fel Protection is going to give another attack and res +4 in combat, 30% DR, that will be halved to 15% because of Laguz Friend, but still, it's something. And then most importantly, she gives that Scowl effect, and what that will essentially do is it will make sure that the special hits into Ike's bigger part of his DR, right? Instead of hitting the 30 or 40% on the first hit, it will hit like the 70%, so it just makes it much easier for Ike to tank it, which is nice. We then have Elamine, and Elamine's going to give that 5 HP and 4 speed. Not the best mythic buff, but it's HP, so that's nice. She also has False Start, which is very effective if Freyr isn't there. She gives out visible defense and res +6, and then she has Holy Ground, which will give 30% drive DR, which will be halved to 15, but even then, still pretty good, and an additional 4 defense and res. Now for both of these mythics, the thing is you do have to be within 2 spaces of Ike to get these effects, and the problem with that is like Sonic Key once again, so that is a little bit of a downside, but they are very powerful. Ratatosker gives a nice 5 HP and 4 speed, once again not the best mythic, but Mending Heart does give out Divine Vein Green, which is anti-warping and guard, 2 things Ike does like. And lastly, we have Naga. I know she is very old as well, but she actually works very well with Ike, and the reason for that is she gives a good mythic buff of 5 HP and defense. She gives +3 to all stats. She also gives Dragon Effectiveness, which can allow Ike to secure more kills. She gives a visible attack SP +6, but most importantly, she gives a guaranteed follow-up attack buff to Ike, which is really nice as it can help him double against those slower enemies who typically don't have no follow. When it comes to other Astra mythics, Aether can be a good option as well, as she can buff up Ike with like Treachery, which can give him even more killing power, so if for some reason you're having a problem with Ike not killing things, that is a good option as well. Okay, with Aether raids done, let's talk about Summoner Duels. I know this isn't everybody's favorite game mode, but Ike is going to do really well here. And this is probably the best archetype he's going to perform in. So currently in the meta, one of the best teams is a dual raid boss team, and I think Ike is going to fit into this team extremely well. Now this is kind of like a prototype you can look at and get some inspiration for. It's not exact, you can kind of swap things around based on what you have, but this is the basic idea of the team. So you're going to have raid boss 1, which will be Ike. Slot 2 is going to be your second raid boss. Some great options here are Altina, Malelir, Attuned Shida, and Anna as well, but don't feel like you have to use these 4. If you have like another invested Omnitank, go ahead and put them in there, they'll probably work just fine. And your third slot is going to be your mobility support. Now, this could be a unit like a Green who gives you 3 movement, it could be someone like Alencia who gives you warping, you can also have a Snap user here who also gives movement, or you can use a different unit who has a guidance or soaring guidance. Now the thing to consider, of course, is that you can combine this role with other roles, so you can combine it with your other support units, or in the case of like Halloween Anna, you're getting your raid boss while still getting mobility support, which does open up a slot for another support. So definitely some room there to customize your team. Your fourth slot is going to be your stat support. This is the unit who's really going to give your raid bosses that extra oomph, someone like Legendary Eliwood who can just give out a ton of stats, Hortensia who can give out a nice amount of stats while also debuffing the enemy team, Gatekeeper who gives out stats while also stopping warping, or someone like Duel who's just going to do a massive debuff on the enemy team, which effectively gives your raid boss more stats. Your final support option is going to be either a Dancer or just another support. Some great options are Dancer Mura, Astra like we discussed earlier. You can also use Legendary Azura, who not only gives you a dance, but also extra movement. Or you can use a unit like Duo Thor, who just really shuts down the enemy team and like lets you really take advantage of that and removes any possible weaknesses your raid boss might have. Once again, this is just a team template, you don't have to use these exact units or anything like that, but this is the general idea. This is essentially the team comp I've been using to hit rank 1 with Altina, and it works extremely well. It's one of the most powerful teams in the current meta, and I think it's going to be getting a lot stronger with the introduction of Emblem Ike. Let's talk about some Ike builds. Now when it comes to the basic build of Ike, you really don't have to change much at all. The only thing you'll really want to be swapping out is his C skill, as Canto Control really isn't used outside of SD all that much, or Aether Raid's defense. A great option is Panic Smoke 4. The only downside of it is that it doesn't really help you out in the first combat, which is the combat where you'll be getting hit the hardest, but afterwards it can help Ike quite a bit. The second build is going to be your SD Raid Boss build. In this build, you're going to be running Canto Control 3, which just ensures that any of those fast units don't get away from Ike and you can take them down. Your A slot could be Fire Flood Boost. It depends on your team. If you're running something like Mirror or Astra, this isn't necessary, but Fire Flood Boost is a really great option for Ike as it does give him guard, which he desperately wants. It also gives him stats, but it also gives him that extra HP, which is very relevant as a raid boss. Our third build is going to be the Arena build here at +10. Essentially what you're going to do here is just change some stuff out. You can run something like Attack Res Ploy 3 at max investment, as Ike does have pretty good resistance and it's going to hit most of the units on the enemy team, which could be pretty strong. You can also run something like Panic Smoke 4 as well if you want to do that. The thing is, as the seal, you have to run Distant Counter M, even though it doesn't really help Ike at all. It is the best scoring seal, so you are forced to use it. Our fourth build is going to be the Light Aether Raids build. This is going to have the Air, Milla, and Goto mythic buffs, and essentially what you're going to do here is just use Panic Smoke as well. You're going to want to run one of the squad ace seals in there. The one that gives defense and res is going to be your best option a majority of the time, and the reason for that is that burn damage is being thrown around everywhere, and so HP is extremely valuable right now. So using those squad seals is going to be one of your best options, if not the best option overall. Our fifth build is just going to be the Astra version of this. It's the same exact build, but we're using Naga, Veil, and Ratatosker instead. As you can see, the resistance is a bit lower, but it shouldn't make that much of a difference. And then finally, we're going to have our Whale build. This is like the +10 maxed out Ike. And as you can see here, I do have HP and Res as his IVs, even though they aren't super boons. Those two are the most valuable stats currently in the meta. That might change in the future, but HP and Res are extremely valuable. And then in the C slot, we do have Incite Attack Res. Currently, this is only on Duo Leon, so I don't really recommend foddering it, but it is a very good skill on Duo Ike, as it just gives him more resistance and visible resistance, which can let him win those resistant matchups. And with that said, that is going to be my Ike analysis, at least for this part of the video. Overall, I do think Emblem Ike is probably the best Omnitank in the game. If not, he's at least top 3 at worst. He's extremely powerful, more powerful than I originally thought, and he has been just destroying everything I've thrown up against him. So, very powerful Omnitank. Let's move on to our Laguz Friend 4 section, where we'll discuss the skill a little bit more, and who else can use it. Okay, so Laguz Friend 4 is inheritable. Unfortunately, it's only inheritable to infantry unit, which does kind of suck, but it is usable on any infantry unit, including mages and staff units as well, which does open up a ton of possibilities for a lot of unique builds and new roles. Now, just a quick reminder again, what this does, essentially attack -5, you have to use a 3 cooldown offensive or defensive special. The reason why this is so important is because ranged units do not have access to defensive specials, which means you have to use a 3 cooldown offensive special. And you have to remember, you have to count slaying as well. For example, let's say you have Flare, which is a 3 cooldown special, but if you have Slaying, it's a 2 cooldown special, and it will not activate Laguz Friend 4, so that is something you have to consider. You also have to consider the Emblem Ring as well, which will also affect this. Essentially what this means is that you're going to be using bigger 4 cooldown specials on units with Slaying, and then you can use 3 cooldown specials on units without Slaying. You could also use any defensive special on melee units, including godlike reflexes, where things get really interesting. Now, before we go over all the builds for this, I really want to explain damage reduction and how it works, because I don't think people really understand. This is something I went over extensively in my Omnitank video. I'll leave a link in the description. But essentially, there are 3 types of damage reduction in the current game. We have pierceable percentage damage reduction, we have non-pierceable percentage damage reduction, and then we have flat damage reduction. So pierceable percentage damage reduction, it reduces the total damage by 1%, as its name implies. It can only reduce damage to 0 if you have 100% of it. It stacks multiplicatively, not additively, and it can be pierced. So it's pierceable by things like Special Spiral 4, or the physical no follow-up or magic no follow-up skills. It's commonly found on things like Close Call 4, Guard 4, NCD 4, or like in weapons and stuff like that. It's like most common damage reduction you'll run into. We then have a non-pierceable percentage damage reduction. This also reduces damage by a total percent. It stacks multiplicatively too, but it cannot be pierced. And it can commonly be found on defensive specials like Aegis or Pavis, preference specials like Altina's, or the new specials like Armored Beacon, Flow, Blaze, or even Dragon's Roar. The newest way, of course, is Ike's Emblem Ring, which is a very big deal and something we'll be discussing a little bit later. The final type of damage reduction is flat damage reduction. This reduces total damage by a flat number, not a percent. It is applied after percentage damage reduction, and it stacks additively, not multiplicatively, which is a very big deal. It also cannot be pierced. The way you can tell this is flat damage reduction is that it will have a sentence like reduces damage by X% of unit stat, or it will have something like reduces damage by a number, so like reduces damage by 7. It is found on Laguz Friend 4, which is why it's such a massive big deal, but we've also seen it on like Hardy Fighter or Shield Pulse as well. Okay, with all that said, hopefully you understand the different types of damage reduction now. Let's talk about how they can be implicated and why they are so powerful. So the way damage reduction works is it stacks directly on top of each other. So in case of Emblem Ike, as you can see, he has 50 damage incoming, but he has 70 non-pierceable DR. That's why it's a brick, it's going through, right? Only 15 of that is going to get through. But then you have Laguz Friend 4, which is flat damage reduction. It reduces the damage reduction by 20% of, let's say, his 60 defense, so it's a flat -12, so it goes down to 3. And this is how damage reduction can be very, very powerful if you stack it properly. Now, the important thing about this and why Ike is so strong is because he is combining percentage damage reduction with flat damage reduction. Percentage damage reduction will never reduce the damage to 0 unless you have 100%, and so because of that, you want flat damage reduction, which just subtracts a number from it, right? And that's why Ike just can take such small amounts of damage. But now, this can be the case for other units as well, thanks to Laguz Friend 4 and Emblem Ike's Ring. A great example of that is Brave Dimitri. As you can see, we can have Ike's Emblem Ring on Brave Dimitri. This will give 40% non-pierceable, so it will take that 50 damage down to 30. Then Laguz Friend will activate and subtract -12, and then Brave Dimitri's flat damage reduction will activate and do another -12, and so he will only take 6 damage. And in fact, you can actually take this a little bit farther, but I'll show that off in the build section. Now I want to show another example where you stack just flat damage reduction and it doesn't work all that well. So we have a Diamant here, and Diamant has flat damage reduction in his weapon, and he also has Laguz Friend here. And so he has 2 types of flat damage reduction, but he has no percentage damage reduction. And because of that, he's going to take a lot more damage. As you can see, the 50 gets reduced by 15, which puts it to 35, and then minus 12, so you get 23 damage, which is a little bit over 50% damage reduction. But as you can see in this example, it's not as much damage reduction as like Ike or Brave Dimitri had. Now Diamant can fix this, of course, we'll explain that with his build section, but this is just an example of how you want to combine percentage damage reduction with flat damage reduction. So when it comes to Laguz Friend 4, like I was mentioning, you want to use it on units who can stack percentage and flat DR, as it's going to be very powerful. So here are some example builds of units who can use it really well, like Brave Dimitri, Diamant, and even Felix. And in this situation, as you can see on Brave Dimitri, he has a ton of different types of DR here. He has the flat DR in his weapon. He has the percentage non-pierceable DR thanks to Ike right there. He gets additional flat DR from Laguz Friend 4, and then he even gets more percentage pierceable DR from Guard Echo. So just lots of stacking there. This will make Brave Dimitri very powerful. Then we have Diamant, who actually is getting a redemption arc here, as now he has ways to get percent DR into his build without it being completely just neutered. Essentially, Diamant will get 40% non-pierceable DR thanks to the Emblem Ike ring. Laguz Friend 4 will let him stack more flat DR as well. Guard Echo technically here doesn't give him any DR, but does give him guard. And the reason why this build is so powerful is because it will essentially allow Diamant to immediately retaliate with a pre-charged Ignis that pierces DR. So that's extremely powerful. It's going to destroy a lot of things. I think Diamant actually is much better now. Then lastly, we have Felix over here, and he's running a Godlike Reflexes build. And because of Laguz Friend 4, this is going to give him DR piercing on the attack after Godlike Reflexes procs. This also gives him a ton of different ways to stack damage reduction while still being fast, which is very nice. Another great option that we have over here is Flame Mordecai, who can take advantage of Laguz Friend 4 as well. He also has flat damage reduction in his weapon, and so just combining that with a defensive special can make him extremely bulky, as defensive specials do stack multiplicatively with Brave Ike's ring, which means you get an absolutely ton of non-pierceable DR, and you can even hit pretty hard because you'll have piercing on the attack after each's procs. But now let's get to some more interesting options. So we have some mages here. I think Duo Astra is going to be the best mage to use Laguz Friend 4 on, but he's definitely not the only one. So the first build I'm going to be showing here is the Miracle build. What this essentially will allow Astra to do is he can pre-charge Miracle before he's hit. So he will have Slaying, and then he'll have Open Domain, which will also give him -1. And then his Duo skill can give an additional -1 cooldown, and then when he gets into combat before the foe's first attack, Laguz Friend 4 will give another -2 cooldown, and so what this will essentially do is it will give Brave Astra damage reduction on that first hit, and it will also have Miracle charged. So this means that they'll have to do enough damage to take Astra to 1 HP through non-pierceable DR, and then also get around Miracle to kill him. This makes Astra an amazing range take, especially when you consider Brave Sword. Now your other option with Astra is you can go for a more offensive build, and you can go for something like Ignis. And because of Open Domain and Laguz Friend 4, he will immediately retaliate with Ignis, just pretty much destroying most of his enemies. But that's not all, we also have some other options for some mage tanks too. We have Arlen over here, one of our new mage tanks, and what essentially he can do with this build is he can have a pre-charged Aether to retaliate with. And not only that, it will allow Aether to have non-pierceable DR as well, and then he'll also get flat damage reduction. Now the thing you do have to consider though is that the pierceable DR will be halved. He has some in his weapon as well as Guard Echo, so that will be halved, but even so, getting the non-pierceable DR from Emblem Ike's ring and Laguz Friend will make him way more bulky and really allow him to play that close counter playstyle. Our second option is a bulkier version of that. With Leon, you essentially go with Arcane Eclipse, which helps charge up Glacies, and then you'll be able to pre-charge that, so once the second you get hit, you'll be able to retaliate with a massive Glacies and destroy your enemy, as it will go through damage reduction. And then our final option is a Flare range tank. Now this is a little bit different, as Flare is a 3 cooldown special, so if you have Slaying, it will not activate. But in the case of Fallen Leon, he does not have Slaying, so he can use Flare. And essentially what this will do is it will allow Fallen Leon to retaliate with Flare, so he can heal up his HP. He'll also have non-pierceable DR, which is really nice, and he'll have flat DR as well. Now the thing is, of course, is that this does half the damage reduction based in his weapon, so that is something you have to consider as well. But as you can see, these are some really cool build ideas that allow mages to once again step into that tanking role as either ranged mage tanks or as close counter tanks as well. And these are just a few options. There's an absolutely ridiculous amount of units who can take advantage of Laguz Friend 4 and combine it with Ike's Emblem Ring to become powerful tanks, the kind we haven't seen in a very long time. I'm very excited to see what people cook up, so make sure to drop a comment down below if you have some cool ideas. Okay, let's move on to actually analyzing Ike Emblem's ring itself. So essentially what this ring does is you get 40% non-pierceable damage reduction once per combat, only versus ranged foes, which is something you definitely have to pay attention to, and it does not work against AoEs as well. This essentially can be tied to any type of special, which is really cool and opens up a lot of options. It also has the effects of every other Emblem Ring, where only one hero can have an Emblem Ring equipped at any time. The Emblem Ring also gives additional stats based off how many merges you have on Emblem Ike, up to +2 to each stat at max merges. Now the really interesting thing is the implications of this ring. This ring will improve survivability for every ranged tank in the game. It adds new ways to get non-pierceable damage reduction, which is extremely valuable in our current meta. It stacks with other types of damage reduction as well. It can give damage reduction to a special like Miracle, and it improves all of our existing specials right now. So something like Vital Astra can gain 28% damage reduction, though some of it is pierceable. Guy like Reflexes can get 24% improved damage reduction, Dragon's Roar gets 24%, Hardy Fighter Aegis goes from 75% to 85% on the first attack, and then another cool thing is that No Quarter can give 40% non-pierceable damage reduction while giving damage reduction piercing, which is really good combo, and it really opens up a lot more build options to our Omnitanks. Okay, let's move on to the final part of the video, the Emblem Ring tier list. So we only have 2 Emblem Rings here, so there's not really much to compare, but we do have Marth and Ike. I'm gonna say that Marth, I believe, is the more powerful Emblem Ring. It's just a much more versatile ring, as stackable slaying is just really good on pretty much any unit, and I don't think it's an effect that will ever really age. It will always be very effective, and so I do think that ring is better overall, but I do not think that Ike's ring is bad. Ike's ring is still very good. It gives us what we really need for tanks at the current moment, just another source of non-pierceable DR, which is very powerful. The thing is, I do think it might age worse, and the reason for that is I think it's only a matter of time until IS gives us a way to get through non-pierceable DR, essentially. And also, this effect only works against ranged foes. It's not both ranged and melee foes, so that's kind of a weakness there. But the biggest thing I have to say is that it doesn't really give a way to get around burn damage, which is the current biggest problem with nukes at the moment. And so while it is an extremely powerful ring, and I do think it is going to revitalize tanking in a big way, I don't think it completely swaps the dynamic of the current meta, where like now tanks are just invincible and can't die, and nukes are just weak. I think it's going to put it more into a balancing act, but I do think this ring is extremely powerful and absolutely worth getting. In my opinion, both of these rings are very powerful and are almost must-haves to your account, as they just offer so much to your entire roster. And with that, my ultimate Emblem Ike guide is complete. Hopefully this guide helped you out, explain some stuff that you maybe weren't sure about, gave you some ideas for builds, or just showed you off how powerful Ike can really be. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. What are you planning to do with Emblem Ike, Laguz Friend 4, or Ike's Emblem Ring? Make sure to drop a comment down below, letting me know all about it. As always, I'd like to thank all my members for their constant support. This has been Oblivion. I'll catch you all later with more Fire Emblem Heroes.